Hi, everybody. This is so great to have so much enthusiasm for plants. I love it. So I'm super excited to be here with you. I'm Cindy Elder. I'm the executive director of the Barrington Land Conservation Trust. And this is one of the events in our 2023 learning series. And we're very grateful. I want to just say to our incredible sponsors, our presenting sponsor, Chart House Realty, and all these fantastic folks who decided this was a good thing, that we should make opportunities for people like Uli to drive an hour and a half to come and tell us about his work. So I just want to thank all of you for being here, and also out in Zoom land, I want to thank you for being here, because I know we have about 50 people and people from all over the country joining us on Zoom. And a special shout out to Charlotte Sornberger, who I know is on Zoom, who is one of our longtime board presidents. Yes, little yay for Charlotte. Wonderful. So Uli Lorimer is Director of Horticulture at the New England Wildflower Society, a national leader in native plant conservation, horticulture, and education. He oversees both Garden in the Woods and the Society's Botanic Garden in Framingham, which is the Society's Botanic Garden in Framingham, and Nasami Farm in Western Massachusetts. His publishing credits are lengthy, but as we know, most recently, he is the author of the book, The Northeast Native Plant Primer, 235 Plants for an Earth-Friendly Garden. He served as curator of the Native Flora Garden at Brooklyn Botanic Garden for 15 years before joining the New England Wildflower Society. And during his time there, Uli tended the original 108-year-old Native Flora Garden, and also was instrumental in the creation of a new extension of the garden, which features a native coastal plain meadow and pine barrens. He worked closely with botanists throughout the region to collect seed from the wild, propagated new plants for collection, and documented and studied the region's biodiversity. And before I have you welcome Uli, I just want to give you a little gift of some honey from Pickwill Nature Preserve in Barrington, from our own little bees there. So I hope you enjoy that. And with that, please welcome Uli Lorimer.
Okay, everybody hears me very well. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and for the little sweet treasure for me to take home. Appreciate that very much. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about native plants and about my book. And I thought I would start off with giving some credit where credit is due. And to honor the women in my life who are responsible for my green thumb. So on the left-hand side of your screen is my maternal grandmother, Renate, who gardened in northern Germany, and my mother and my wife. And I have a lot of fond memories as a child. In the summers, we would travel to Germany to spent time with my grandparents, and my grandmother and I used to go on nightly slug hunts. And so her garden sort of abutted a number of cow pastures, and my job was to take a pail and a trowel and a flashlight and trail her around and try to chop slugs in half, because they would emerge in mass from the cow fields to try to devour her garden. You know, I've always had sort of a boyish enthusiasm for the natural world. I always wanted to know what was underneath of logs and rocks, and was just one of those kids that was really just curious about the natural world. When we moved to the United States, we moved to Wilmington, Delaware, and we lived maybe 20 minutes away from Longwood Gardens. As you can see, my sister and I here in the early 80s. Visiting Longwood Gardens, and we had a year where we lived in Arizona as well. And I'd like to think that those early exposures to these, world-class gardens had a real sort of formative effect on my career choice. And I'd also like to think that I haven't lost that boyish enthusiasm and energy for the natural world. And I like that it's carried forth into my professional career. While at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, they have just a sampling of pictures with various insects and critters and salamanders crawling all over me, or in one case, I am extolling the virtues of sedges to my interns. But I've always loved all plants. And I think that is, that's sort of what underlies all of this, even though much of my work involves indigenous plants to this region. I still have a degree of respect for even invasive plants for their tenacity. And I don't think that it's not entirely right to wage all-out war and poison. So even though I do think that they are very problematic. So in a public horticulture career that has spanned over 20 years now, I've come to recognize that advocacy for native plants has to be inspirational and has to be hopeful and has to be a positive message. You're not going to win very many friends by garden shaming. I'm not here to tell you that you're doing it wrong, that you're planting the wrong plants, or that you've made the wrong choices. Rather, I think that, and I really truly believe in the two statements that you see up here, that native plants or regionally appropriate plants have this wonderful power to form a bridge between the natural world and us via our gardens. And I think that just the simple act of encouraging or welcoming a plant into your garden and seeing the effect that it has and the support for other kinds of wildlife is a really enriching and empowering activity. And that's sort of ultimately the message is to try it out and see. There are a number of challenges certainly that this approach faces. First and foremost, defining what is ecological horticulture. How does it differ? How does it differ from traditional horticulture? And I would sum it up in saying that it's an approach that seeks to weigh aesthetics and ecological value and function equally. And I think for a long, long time, we've often thought of gardens as ornament. How can we make something that's really pretty to look at, that has exciting textures and colors and combinations? And any sort of intentional support for the organisms with which these plants have relationships tends to be an afterthought, rather than something that's intentional and put first and foremost. And so to do that, we also sort of have to push back against a little bit of the formal aesthetic that has been imported with us from our European ancestors. And for many people, a beautiful garden is something that is neat and tidy and straight lines, and the plants don't touch each other, and they swim in the sea of mulch, which just ties it all together really nicely. But these are things that are sort of an anathema to ecology, all right? It's not where insects and birds and other things want to make their homes. Reducing lawns has certainly gotten increasingly more press. And not that the book is entirely about that, but I think it's part and parcel of a shift in how we think of our gardens. And again, a kind of a push against what I sometimes call the Augusta syndrome. We don't need our lawns to look like a putting green at Augusta National. And lawns are resource intensive, pesticides, they're thirsty, they need a lot of fertilizer, and they don't really provide much other than a green carpet for ourselves. Now, that said, I am the proud owner of a 2- and a 5-year-old, and I very much appreciate the utility of lawns. So, you have to have a space for them to run around. But inherently in gardening too, that change comes slowly. And this is something I think that we can also really embrace, even though there is a sense of urgency now, particularly with all of the bad environmental news that's swirling around. Success in gardens is not measured by how many plugs you can plant. It's measured season by season. And we have to sort of think along the lines of the organisms with which we're working. So they exist on a very different temporal scale than we do. So I would say if there's ever a time to welcome native plants, the time is now. I think that there are a number of reasons that are sort of driving the surge in interest in this approach in gardening. And I think that there's, and I hesitate to say this is a positive that is drawn out of our recent few years of pandemic living. But being forced to be home was kind of eye-opening for a lot of people to say, you know, hey, I have the space out back and now I have to spend time in it. And it's actually really rewarding and amazing. And what can I do with it? I think there's a lot of anxiety around what the future holds in terms of climate change, particularly for gardeners who have gardened for decades and know that the sort of regularity of seasons and things that you can count on, and the snow cover and hot in the summer and so forth, all of that seems to be not as consistent anymore. You're not really sure what the future holds. There's a slew of bad news out there about losses of biodiversity and so forth. You know, if I go back to Wilmington, Delaware now, and I haven't lived in Delaware since 1995, maybe. But there are certainly portions of where I grew up that are unrecognizable because the little woodlots that used to be woods are now more houses or subdivision. And so there's just this overall perception that we're continuing to lose natural space. And this is, again, I would say, one of the more important functions of land trust conservancy organizations in protecting that open space so that it remains open space. All of that sort of grouped together, the desire for people to do something positive to support the planet, I think, is a really powerful motivator. I do want to take a slight little tangent here and talk about biodiversity for a minute and introduce a different concept. And it's a mouthful, I'm sorry, this is a relatively new direction in conservation. So if we think of biodiversity, we think of it as a number of the different kinds of things in a particular space. So I can put on my botanist hat and I can look at this beautiful meadow scene here from Kennebunk Plains in Maine. And I could say there are 137 different species of vascular plants, and maybe I'll invite my entomology friends or some ornithologists to come in, and we can come up with a number of the different kinds of things. But what it doesn't tell you in any way is the relative proportion of every one of those things. You could have a meadow full of invasive plants and 4 native plants and still have a total of 5 as a biodiversity number. So the idea of proportionality is really asking how much of any one individual thing is needed in order for it to be able to adapt and change in an uncertain world. And it's not necessarily a number, and science doesn't have the answers for this yet. But I think that it's a call for gardeners and gardening designers to plant a lot of plants, to plant a lot of one thing. And collectively, if you put in 25 goldenrods and your neighbor puts in 50 and the person down the road puts in 75, collectively you've added towards this number, whatever it may be, that helps them all connect and exchange genetic information and adaptations and be able to change and adapt. Biodiversity is also sometimes used to justify the destruction of one place as long as there's something equivalent nearby. And I think that's false. Just in the same way, you can't cut down a 200-year-old oak and plant a new one and say it's a one-for-one swap. And so if we think in longs in terms of proportionality, then maybe you don't cut down or you don't bulldoze this one spot because it has enough of one thing that needs to be saved in order for its right to thrive and adapt. So just something to get the kind of wheels turning if you're thinking about welcoming native plants in your garden. If you have space for a couple, that's great. If you have space for 100 or 500, all the more better, because that all gets us closer to there being more of it around for its own survival. Now, the popularity of native plants can be measured in a lot of different ways. Native Plant Trust has gotten a lot of requests from DOTs in different states. They're looking to transition mowed right-of-ways to pollinator strips or pollinator habitat. Pollinator pathways themselves are grassroots efforts to try to connect natural areas through towns and municipalities. One of my staff members was involved in a really successful passing of a native plant ordinance in the city of Somerville, which has now legislated the use of native plants. So any new public planting projects have to have at least 75% native plants, which is really fantastic. And there's been a lot of interest in how that actually happened. You know, people want to see how the sausage was made. And it took them nearly 2 years and lots of back and forth with the city. And frankly, having the right kinds of people to advocate for it is ultimately what made it successful. And whether or not it'll be successful in your township or city depends on the people involved and how passionate folks are. Every botanical garden that I visit has some kind of native plant display now. Shopping centers, there's one close to where I live that has landscaped the shopping center with native plants, albeit they're cultivars of native plants, but it's still a win. And I think it blends nicely and more nicely into the surrounding landscapes. I had another friend of mine who moved to North Carolina and bought a house in a neighborhood that was intentionally, they tried to preserve as much of the woods that were there before while they were doing the construction, and everything was you know, landscaped with locally sourced native plants, and that was part of the selling point of the neighborhood, is that it's, you know, it's greener, you need less fertilizers and so forth, you get more wildlife attracted to it, and these are all kind of hopeful signs. In the private sphere, we have increasingly people that are looking to shrink their lawns and making it a little bit smaller. This article here, while it's still about a year or so out of date, is still a really good article because it tracks the experience of a particular couple who decided to turn their front yard into a pollinator meadow, and the subsequent 2 to 3 year legal battle that they faced with their homeowners association. And they were successful after, you know, lots of legal fees and ultimately intervention from the Maryland State Senate. But what it does tell you is a little bit of a cautionary tale, and also talks about the degree of courage that sometimes is necessary to step outside of what is assumed is, you know, the aesthetic that everybody in a neighborhood should adopt. There are increasingly new generations of landscape designers and architects that are, they emphasize ecology, they emphasize native plants as part of their curriculum. And I can say, at least from our standpoint at Native Plant Trust, we've seen over the last 3 years about a sustained annual 25 to 30% increase in education registration. So, you know, all of our online courses, everything is really popular. So there's also this thirst for knowledge out there. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, would you ever see native plants gracing the front covers of nationally syndicated gardening magazines? I would say no. It's usually like way back of page, you know, back of issue, like, you know, maybe a little list of it. But, you know, these are signs that this is gaining in popularity, and it's gaining, the message is getting out there that these plants are really useful and beautiful and functional. And I have to say that it is something that is unique to this continent. I was approached recently by Noel Kingsbury. Anybody know who Noel Kingsbury is? He's a well-respected English horticulturalist. And he runs a program called Garden Masterclass. And so it's all of like the big name English designers who talk about how their practices. And they're very keen to pick up on this sort of naturalistic design trend that's happening now, and they're keen to push into the American market because this is where it's happening. It's not happening over there. And I think we can take a little sense of pride in that, you know, we live in a country where there's still such amazing botanical biodiversity that's still left, vis-a-vis a place like England that has been turned over and deforested for many, many, many thousands of years. So it's something that's particularly unique, and I hesitate to call it an American garden, but it is something that is unique to us. Even American Horticulture Society is picking up on it here, talking about native annuals. How many folks knew that April was Native Plant Month? One person. Thank you, Sally. So this year also, I should say that April was also designated Native Plant Month, National Native Plant Month. And this is a rare example of bipartisanship in Congress. And this has been the sort of brainchild of the Garden Clubs of America. a really formidable group of people for which I have a lot of respect. They are currently trying to target all of the governors in states in which their clubs are active to permanently designate April as Native Plant Month as a way to celebrate diversity and programming and raise awareness around these fantastic plants. Last example I'll show you here, in the last place I thought I would find information about native plants is Forbes magazine. But even they're picking up also on hottest new trends, which I hope is not a trend and something that will continue. But it's a lovely article about a nursery owner in Tennessee who's transitioned to native plants and has had a really great welcome reception. So native plant sales are certainly growing. As Cindy mentioned, I also have oversight over our retail operation and nursery out in Whately, Massachusetts. Again, we have seen 30 to 35% increases in sales consistently over the last 4 years. Last year was the first year that we topped $1 million in sales, which is fantastic for a small nursery. And our current problem is that we're running out of space to keep the stock plants. They just keep coming in, coming. So good problems to have. There's a number of new native plant nurseries that are also picking up on this, at least in Massachusetts there are. And so all of this, you can attend talks like this, but I think it's still hard to find native plants, even if you want to get them. And there's some good reasons for this. The nursery industry 5 years ago was nearly $350 billion. It's a pretty big business. And asked about why now more native plants are available. It's the availability of the species, consumer preferences driving this, as well as just general lack of knowledge about native plants. There's also quite a lot of, I would say, aggressive and misleading marketing behind this because people want you to buy their plants so they can get the royalties. My own personal opinion about every year about the hottest new plants that get out there, the new cultivars that are out there, it's just more repackaging of stuff that's been out already. There's nothing new that's being put out here. And then I'd say that we could probably all agree that the label information is pretty useless, particularly when it comes to ecological value. So native plant nurseries tend to be smaller. They tend to have less capital. Availability of seed is a huge bottleneck. And there's some really exciting efforts going on here in Rhode Island with Rhode Island Wild Plant Society and at Native Plant Trust as well. So please keep an eye on our communication channels for more information on that. But we're attempting to put together a seed network for the Northeast, a coordinated effort to increase the availability of native plant seeds. So not only to serve restoration projects, but also to get into the horticulture industry so that we can tell you about these fantastic plants and then you can actually find them. So that's always a big disconnect. But when you do shop at nurseries, oftentimes only a quarter of what's available is considered native. So still 3/4 of what's being sold is non-native and it's ornamental. This study focuses on the wholesale industry, which is worth noting because that's where the folks that landscape the shopping centers and corporate parks and new subdivisions and so forth, they all shop at those places. So even if they wanted to do it, it'd be really hard to find it. And nobody seems to care about provenance, and I'll come to that in a little bit. A case study of misleading marketing for you. This is sort of a trend now in plant breeding is that they release series of different plants. And they're all registered, trademarked. As you can see, names that I think belong in an ice cream shop. And really, if you didn't know very much about plants and you were just getting into gardening and you knew that bees like nectar and sweet things, you might think, wow, like bubblegum blast must be perfect for bees. This is great. So let me find out some more information about it. So I go to the website and you see that all the different registered cultivars here are just different shades of pink for one thing. They tell you that it's native to North America. So that's a good start. Thank you. And then the other information, they tell you that it's bee friendly. Well, okay, so you saw a bee on it. We can do a little better on being bee friendly. And most of these, if they're registered and trademarked, they're also patented plants, which means they're all clones of one another. So this is, again, the lack of transparency in the nursery industry about propagation. practices leads people to think that the plants they're putting out there, all you care about is the different shade of pink. This is the plant series for you. But I think that gardeners are far more savvy than that, and they want more and better information to make informed choices. There's a lot of debate around, are cultivars the equivalent of species? And so when we continue to change plants based on their our aesthetic preferences, so we're changing the leaf color, for example, or we're changing the flower timing, or in some cases creating double flowered things, which undeniably are beautiful, it has no value for an insect if there's no nectar or pollen that's producing. We don't know what we're doing to the floral chemistry, for example. And there's quite a bit of research around why certain insects go to certain flowers because of the quality of the nectar and the quality of the pollen that it produces. Yet consumer preferences, you do studies and surveys, everybody likes double flowered things. People like the endless summer hydrangeas, and what those are sterile flowers that just hang out, and it gives the impression of being in bloom for years, for weeks and weeks on end, but provides nothing to your local wildlife. So things that eat insects, eat plants, for example, herbivores, they said this study found that if the foliage was changed to red or purple or blue, it had a negative impact. So all the things that like to eat, so maybe a host plant, the caterpillar that could turn into a butterfly, isn't going to recognize a plant if the foliage is maroon or dark colored. This is also fairly good research here around Dr. Annie White evaluating species and cultivars for pollinator preference. In general, pollinators preferred the species. So, and I take that as a sign that you can't really improve on Mother Nature's design. And these relationships were forged through evolution over, countless generations. Stay away from things that differ drastically from the original species. And if you can get things that are seed grown or open pollinated. So I think using cultivars, if that's what you have available, is a great choice. And you should feel empowered by doing that. If you have seed grown, locally sourced plant material available, it's a better option if you can get it. But I don't want anybody to feel ashamed that they planted a cultivar of a native plant. I think it's a good step in the right direction. The only one place where I would actually shame you is if you're using a non-invasive plant. You're planting Phragmites or mugwort or burning bush or something. Yes, shame. We can do better. That's a case for garden shaming. The other thing that I like about this, and this is also supported by research, is that gardens that have a minimum of 2/3 or 70% native plants support the highest species diversity of insects, the highest diversity of bird life. And it's a goal. Don't feel bad if you're not there yet. Again, change comes slowly, and you do it a little bit at a time, year after year. And what the other third leaves room for is all the other wonderful garden plants that are already on the market that play nice with others. Maybe it's a peony that you got from your grandmother that has nostalgic value for you. There's no reason not to plant those too. You don't have to be a complete purist. So why does provenance matter? All right, so this is where something is from. In the art world, provenance is a record, documentation of ownership. It lends authenticity to an item. It says you can track its origin through to when somebody created it. In the natural world, it's the beginning of its existence. It's tied to a place, and a lot of the genetic diversity that we see as being really crucial to plants' abilities to change in face of climate change, all that genetic diversity and adaptability are closely tied to local provenance. All right, and that's what we say when we call something an ecotype. It's from a place. So we collect seed from out here in Rhode Island. That becomes a Rhode Island ecotype, and we believe those plants are adapted to the conditions here, not the ones in Connecticut, not the ones in Massachusetts or New York State. And state boundaries, the plants don't care about our state boundaries. I'll come to that in a little bit. So why is it important? So growing degree days is a way of measuring the average number of days per year above freezing. So if you live in Florida, well, we know it's pretty nice down there. And you can grow all kinds of stuff because it almost never goes below freezing. But as you get further north, you can see that the number of days above freezing gets shorter and shorter. Take into account coastal cities where the climate is tempered by their proximity to water. But so if you're a gardener in Bangor, your plants have just about 5 months to grow, make a flower, set seed, will get pollinated, get set seed, and disperse that seed. So if you have, let's say, red maple is always a good example because it's a plant that grows all the way from Florida up into Maine. All right, you take a plant that's from Florida and you plant it in Maine, it's not going to do very well. It's used to a longer season, so it's going to take longer to set flower and longer to make the seed and so forth. This is why provenance is important, and not just for the survival of the plants itself, but for all of the relationships that the plants support. So again, we believe that they're best adapted, they maintain those existing relationships, they maintain the genetic diversity that's inherent here. So these are not clones of plants, these are ones that have adaptations that might confer more drought tolerance, for example. You know, if we're thinking about climate change and things getting hotter and drier, you want plants that are going to be able to survive. And generally require less resources. All of that together kind of adds up to the sort of beautiful choreography and phenology, and that the insects and the plants all emerge together in a wonderful, beautiful timing that happens. This is some of the diversity here at Garden in the Woods in one day. You know, hummingbird, clearwing moths, and, you know, different sweat bees and other sorts of things. And it's mutually beneficial. You know, for plants, the end is make seed, pass on adaptations, and they will use the insects to get that done. And the insects will use the plants because the resources the plants provide allow the insects to be reproductively successful and pass on adaptations. And so they benefit each other. So gardens that are species rich have more opportunities for those plant-insect interactions, and it's a form of pollinator conservation. And the more you have those interactions, the more of those resources are passed on up the food chain for the insects and the seeds that are produced that the squirrel and the chipmunk likes to eat, all the way up to the beautiful red-tailed hawk that I captured disemboweling a squirrel that most certainly ate seeds from some plant that were pollinated by insects, and all goes back and around and around. Some of the relationships are incredibly specific. So there's a spring beauty mining bee that can only survive if there's spring beauties around. So it needs that specific pollen and that specific nectar in order to be around. Most folks understand the relationship between monarchs and milkweeds. Here are some of the non-traditional milkweeds that are out there. They're beautiful too, and they're not the only ones that eat milkweeds. You've got tussock moths and dogbane beetles, and of course monarchs, because that's what you want to see in your garden. Other relationships, like the colonie here, which is absolutely delightful to watch bees struggle to push into the flowers and back out. This is the sole host plant for the Baltimore checker spot. And so if you want to have this beautiful butterfly around in your garden, you have to have that particular plant. And those relationships extend beyond just birds and bees and, you know, beautiful things. Crab spiders, for example, that have evolved to hang out perfectly camouflaged in that particular flower. Goldenrod crab spiders that can, and you can see the victim in the background there. These guys can, in about 3 or 4 days, completely change their body color from white to yellow to hang out in a different color flower. Amazing stuff. So with these specific relationships, one of the greatest kind of analogies that I can think of are dietary restrictions. You know, I have a niece and a nephew that are celiac, so I understand very keenly about gluten and how that is a serious issue for them and their health. About 25% of our bee species here in the Northeast are pollen specialists. or specialists. So in other words, they have what you would describe as a dietary restriction. They tend to be smaller. They tend to be solitary nesting. And they're much more susceptible to climate change, to if their preferred plant is not around, they're not around. And so we're losing that overall biodiversity with that. The following list of plants here are ones that have been identified to support not only specialist pollinators, but also generalists as well. So there's this wonderful relationship with the shape of the flower and the size of the insect. Things like the sunflower out here, it's kind of like a big party bowl. Like everybody can get inside. It doesn't matter if you're big or small, you can all get in there. If you have a tubular shaped flower, for example, you need to either have a long tongue or be shaped in a way to get in there. So that is evidence of this evolutionary relationship. So a lot of wonderful plants. And so again, if you're a designer here, you've got lots to choose from. So in the carrot family, we've got our golden Alexanders and Zizias. The aster family has loads of examples that are both for specialists and generalists. Fleabings, asters, tickseed, black-eyed Susans, sunflowers, blazing stars, thistles, ironweeds, sneezeweeds, goldenrods. We have a lot of goldenrods. Now I will say, we'll come back to this in a minute, not all goldenrods are great for every garden. Some are better than others, depending. Joe pie weeds, beggar's ticks, bone sets, groundsels. These are all wonderful plants for supporting, and specifically for supporting these organisms. Campanulas and the heath family. These are all your rhododendrons, azaleas, mountain laurels, swamp hobbles, wintergreens, huckleberries, maleberries, staggerberries, blueberries. Anybody getting hungry? Cranberries, Massachusetts state flower here, Epigea. Lots of great mints as well. And then I'm a big fan of violets. Violets are wonderful. They're cheerful. They come early in the season. If they're ever too abundant, you can thin them out really easily. They come in lots of nice colors. There are plants that support insects that have short tongues, so they don't have to get really in there that long. So things like your milkweeds here. There are plants for insects that have long tongues. You can see long tubular shapes here. You can see that relationship coming together. A lot of stuff that's going on here. Baptisias, even our jewelweed, which is one of our native annuals, is also a great hummingbird plant. Plants that produce a lot of pollen, all the nectar, all the stamens out there. Also want to put out a plug for willows. Willows are both wind pollinated and insect pollinated, and they're easily the very first thing to come into bloom in the springtime. So they're important to have resources throughout the entire year. Now, I've always liked this slide as well. This is the Atlantic flyway. You know, it's an older slide, but I think it really hammers home the point of all the different groups of birds that come through this area, either as residents or as migrants. 96% of our songbirds need insects to successfully rear young. If you want the songbirds to set up and nest in your yard, you have to give them enough resources in order for them to do that. How many? Well, this study showed that Carolina chickadees need between 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise a brood of 5 chicks. That's a lot of caterpillars. And I will say that no other groups of plants support that degree of insect diversity than our native ones. And I'm riding on the coattails of Doug Tallamy a little bit here and saying, you know, oaks and cherries and elms and maples are really top keystone species for that reason. It's not to say that non-native are devoid of supporting insects. You just get way more when you use those ones. So things you can do. Again, aim for 70% native, embrace species diversity, leave the leaves. This is another one. Many of our insects overwinter in leaf litter. This is another thing that drives me crazy when it's fall and the leaf blower guys come and they blow every leaf out of the way just to put mulch back on again. I think asking questions when you buy plants, A, is it with pesticides? B, can you tell me if you know where the plant's from, are really wonderful things. And of course, sharing your knowledge. So the backdrop of all of that, I tried to figure out, well, how can I put all of this 20 years of experience into a book? And I want it to be inspirational and something that can be really useful for people. So I'm happy that the book turned out the way it did. And so a few things from the book I think that are important to mention. First of all is the concept of ecoregions. So this is a way of looking at what is appropriate for where you live based on how plants are distributed on the landscape. Again, they don't care about county boundaries or state boundaries or political boundaries. Ecoregions take into account soil type, geology, land use, plant community history, hydrology, all those things, and draw together similar areas. So Cindy mentioned that I did a lot of work in Atlantic coastal plain grasslands and pine barrens, and it was primarily in southern New Jersey and Long Island. But I'd be just at home out on the Cape and in portions of Rhode Island because it's a very similar flora, similar conditions, and that's why all those regions are united together into a single ecoregion. If you were looking to source your plants, you'd want to source it from within that region because they're adapted to those conditions. That's kind of the conceptual idea. The next thing I bring into it is a little bit of ecology, in that some of our plants have evolved to occupy space. So I think New England is a great example because we had a lot of agriculture that was then abandoned in favor of making money in other places. And what happened to those old farm fields? In some cases now they're second growth forest, and you can tell because the stone walls are still there. In other cases, this process is just beginning. And so the plants that move into those spaces that are abandoned tend to be shade intolerant. They tend to be aggressive. They tend to make a lot of seed and a lot of rhizomes. And they're probably really ill suited for a small garden. So Canada goldenrod is the example that I use. It's a fantastic plant. It hosts lots and lots of insects, has great wildlife value, but if you put it in a small yard, it's going to take over and you're going to be disappointed because you're going to spend all your time ripping it out or trying to push it back. There are other goldenrods that make a clump and play nicely and are not part of that sort of advanced guard of like we want to prepare the ground for the next group of plants to move in. So these tend to be called pioneer species or rooterals. And it's important to know this so you don't make the mistake. I have killed a lot of plants. Even though I'm a professional, I have killed them. And I've learned from each and every one of them. And there's ones that I put in the ground, I wish I never did, because I can't get rid of them now. So even professionals and experts make mistakes too. What you do with that information is really the key part, and to learn from it. And that nobody's perfect. That's the beauty of gardening. Creating habitat for wildlife is really simple. Cover the ground in plants, not in mulch. Create layers within your garden. Throw in a source of water and you're really good to go. It's really fantastic. You know, as I said, we've got to this point where gardens can be more than just pretty. This was a little collage that I put in to show all of the ugly pollinators on a particular plant. So they're like big nasty flies, cicada killers, daddy longlegs, all of them in service of making this beautiful seed head down the bottom. And what I love is that goldfinches use that fluff to line their nests in the springtime. And are probably busy eating the same insects the next year too. And it's just this wonderful circle of life. Lawns, as we said, is big business. Half of average household use and water use goes to lawns. It's pretty ridiculous. And they don't really support a whole lot. Now, ripping them wholesale isn't something that everybody's prepared to do, but you can reduce it. If you ever have like a little spot that's like weird to mow, like you have to push up and go back and forth, transition that into some like a lawn alternative, or add diversity into your lawn. Like I plant crocus into my lawn. And it's wonderful because they come up in the springtime and it's cheerful. And I put violets in there and bluets and other things that provide some diversity, and then they all melt away in the summer. I'm a big fan of No Mow May because it raises awareness around the issue. I will say my criticism of it is that it's performative. All right, not mowing your lawn for 1 month and you go back to doing everything you do normally isn't going to provide all that much for pollinators. You get more if you actually diversify your lawn or shrink it and provide other resources. But I like it again because it also helps people accept the less tidy aesthetic a little bit more. So the book is also unique in that I only recommend species. Again, because I really believe that from an ecological standpoint, you can improve on Mother Nature's design. And if you can get the plants, they need to be seed grown, known provenance to embrace that genetic diversity. And again, making those connections, the plants support the insects that support the food. I included a lot of lists in the book because I like lists. And so there are different lists for, evergreen shrubs or suckering shrubs. There's a whole section on which plants are known to be host plants for moths and butterflies. Pollinator gardens are all fantastic, but if you don't add host plants into the mix, you're not going to get the butterflies and things that you want to see. They have to have a plant to turn from caterpillar into butterfly. It's not just all about the flowers. So there are 235 plants here. All of them have a plant profile that gives you all the information here. There's little icons next to some of them that will tell you whether it is used by birds, whether it is a caterpillar host, whether it is like the little frog icon, for example, because we shouldn't forget about amphibians and reptiles. They use plants too. And just to show that, this is habitat, this is home for a lot of things. 2 examples here are red and black chokecherry that have all of the icons, and the language that I use in the descriptions really tries to hammer home that, this is how you use the plants, but you also can support a lot of wildlife with it. There's sections on vines, on wildflowers, and also a small section on native annuals. And I think native annuals are also something that most people don't think of as being an option. And they most certainly will flower in 1 year, because if they don't survive. But they're not intended to be long-term members. If you can set them in place, they may move around, they may seed in. If it's ever too much, they're easy to thin. And they've got great value and add a little splash of color in some of the tough spaces that are out there. So ultimately, I think of this as a very much forward-looking act. I had to sneak in a picture of my son when he was younger into the book, but I want to leave you with a little synopsis and some of the language here, in that we're not trying to recreate conditions from the past. All right, I don't think it makes any sense to think that we can create gardens that look like what this country looked like before Europeans got here. It's not really feasible. Rather, I would think of it as a forward-thinking act for the future and an act of compassion for what remains. Some people think of it as being limiting or elitist in a way, to only use native plants or really base them. And I think that if you challenge what your values are you gardening for yourself or you're gardening for more than yourself, then you can see the argument doesn't hold. And I see that it's not necessarily a shackle, it's an act of liberation. It shows that you value the ability of future generations to enjoy all of the benefits of biodiversity that we have, that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have enjoyed as well. So your choices really do matter, and hopefully you can move forward as an informed and educated gardener and make the choices that are right for you. Thank you very much for listening.
I think we're going to take a few questions. We're going to start with the questions that were submitted with your registration. And I also did just want to say that how special it is to be having this presentation where here we are sitting on the land that once was the ancestral homeland of the Poconoke people. And that as we think about these native plants, how important it is for us to honor those plants, to honor this land, and to honor the people who once lived here and who in fact still live here. So with that, I will hand it back to Uli to respond to these questions. And then as time allows, we'll take any other questions. Also, I want to let you know that we do have Uli's book on sale. We're asking for a $25 contribution to the Land Trust for the book. And Uli's made that possible, and you can do that with cash or credit card.
Seem to cooperate.
Oh, you're back.
Ooh. But it's not, okay, okay, here I am. All right, so thank you for that. I'm also happy to sign books afterwards as time allows. So a few questions that were submitted ahead of time. Mary Grover from Barrington asked about what my favorite native shrub for a homeowner's yard would be. That's a really tough question. I know the book has 235 plants. I had wanted to put in like 500. But I would say for springtime, one of my all-time favorites is our Pinkster Bloom azalea. This is a moderately sized azalea, maybe 10 feet at maturity, has really beautiful light pink blossoms that are incredibly fragrant, and very, very long stamens that extend out of the floral tube that kind of remind me like eyelashes. It's a very regal and stately looking plant. And so that's always one of my long-term favorites. I also really like sweet fern. It's another one. It's a shrub that looks like a fern and has just really wonderful fragrance. It's the kind of thing that you want to put wherever you might brush against it, because then you'll get a little bit of that fragrance coming up. And for fall color, I would say I will go with our aronias. The two that I showed before have absolutely brilliant red fall color and are good choices for all those different seasons. Elizabeth Foley here asks, is there organic pesticides for roses that doesn't harm pollinators? I would suggest looking into neem oil. So this is an extract from a tree that grows in India that has some fungicidal compounds in it. Because it's a natural product, it does tend to have less of an impact. The other resource that I would point people to is a group. It's an organization that's based in California. The website that they run is called birc.org. It's the Biointegral Resource Center. And they publish a couple of quarterly journals, one called IPN Practitioner, and the other one is called Common Sense Pest Quarterly. They also once a year publish sort of a big like resource guide. So it goes through all of the different organic and non-toxic options for insects, for animals, for diseases, along with all of the vendors that will sell you these products. And so whether it's beneficial insects, plant-based products, physical exclusion. So, if you've got, you need some remake cloth to keep your cabbage white loopers off your vegetables, this is a place for that. So I've been a long-time subscriber, and I think it's a great resource around the idea of IPM. So, and I assume everybody knows what IPM is? Yes, very good. Okay. So Richard Anderson from Bristol asks, what are the best plants to attract bees? So what I would say is you want to make sure, and I would, and I'd be happy to make the presentation available if you want to distribute it to folks later, because there was a lot of information there. Okay, perfect. But so I think more importantly is to make sure you have some kind of floral resource for as long of the season as possible than any one particular plant. There's not going to be one plant that's going to attract all the bees. It's going to be a combination of things that start early in the spring from your willows all the way through to the really late flowering asters and goldenrods that are still blooming in October in some cases. That's going to do more to support bees than any one singular plant will. I would also say even more important than that is to make sure that the plants that you choose were not grown with pesticides, that the seeds were not treated with neonicotinoids, because I find it is one of the cruelest ironies possible to be poisoning the very things that you think you're supporting because you didn't know that the plant was grown using pesticides. So there are plenty of people, very talented propagation folks and nursery folks that can grow plants without pesticides. There's no reason to use them anymore. And so that is sort of like the number one question when you go to the nursery is to ask. And if they can't answer your question, you're going to have to do one of the hardest things in your life. Walk away empty-handed. I know you go there and you're confronted by all these beautiful flowers and you made the extra trip to go there and you're not going to go away empty-handed, but the only way that folks will listen and understand that this is something that's really important to gardeners is if you vote with your dollar. You say, hey, I would love to spend all my money here, but unless you can guarantee this, or this is really important to me, please find out. Whatever way you want to leverage it. But I think that's really important. And that, again, really supports overall pollinator health much more than any single particular plant will. So I'll take one more question here from Nicole Kirkos from Riverside here, asking what native plants are best around and in a small wildlife. So here I think you're going to want to have a combination of some shrubs, so things that will provide some structure for birds to hang out in. Things like winterberry, for example, are really wonderful. If you do grow winterberry hollies, make sure you have both a male and a female, because you won't get the berries without the male. And if you just plant the males, then you won't ever get any berries, because it's not possible. Things like irises, things that are going to extend the planting, so there's not just a hard edge at where the water stops. So things that don't mind having their feet a little bit wet. There's lots of wonderful, wet meadow plants, again, assuming that you have some sunlight in your little pond area here. Things like Joe Pye weeds are really great, blue vervain. Those are just a few things that come to mind. Certainly some goldenrods that will do well, and asters as well. So, but think of it more around providing some structure as well as floral resources for wildlife. So with that, I'd be happy to take some questions from the audience if there are any.
So we're asking if the liquid fence is hurting other things while in an effort to get rid of the bunnies.
Okay. Yeah. So the liquid fence stuff it won't hurt the other things. It just makes the plants taste bad. I don't know. I don't think it has any effect on pollinators or on insects that might want to eat the foliage. It's funny that you mentioned the bunny thing. I had was contacted by the Boston Globe recently to comment on why there were so many bunnies. So it's not just a trend. And then I will say in my own yard, every morning I wake up and there's like 4 bunnies in the yard. And I don't know what it is. Maybe the hawks are taking a year off, or there's not enough foxes. There's, you know, well, I mean, all of these things go in cycles. So, you know, that if there's a glut of bunnies this year, maybe there'll be a glut of foxes the next year, because the few that are around are going to eat really well and they'll reproduce and have more kits than normal. But the liquid fence stuff, it is effective. You just have to commit to reapplying it periodically, because it does degrade, and if it rains, it gets washed off and so forth. So, but I don't think it's particularly harmful otherwise.
So sadly, we have to wrap up because of the library's hours. But we're gonna, if you want to buy a book on the way out, that's great. And then we can ask Uli a question at that point. Sure. So big thanks for Uli, and thank you to the library.
Thank you. Thank you.